live in a very interesting era for video. Once upon a time, within my lifetime in fact, the tools for producing and editing video were incredibly esoteric and expensive and large, but nowadays they're so widely available, what with phone cameras and high-powered GPUs and DaVinci Resolve Free Edition, that almost anyone who wants to do video art can. In fact, I'd wager that an awful lot of people watching this will have dabbled in video editing to one degree or another, and there's a good chance that you know the phrase non-linear editor. At this point, it's really a redundant term. Whether you use Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, Sony Vegas, Final Cut Pro, Power Director, or Kdenlive, every PC-based video editor falls under this same banner. It's so universal, in fact, that people rarely even bother spelling it out. Typically, they're just called NLEs. But once in a while, someone will say the whole phrase, and that might leave you wondering, if these are all non-linear, did they replace something that was? And if so, what was that like? Well, the short answers to both questions are yes, and ask me some other time. I'm busy, kid. Seriously though, linear editing was a thing, and I've wanted to make a video about it for years, but what's been stopping me is that, frankly, it's well beyond my ability to cover in depth. I've always come up short on both knowledge and equipment, so I keep putting it off, but the former problem isn't getting any better, and the latter is getting worse. What little equipment I can find is rapidly dying. The machines behind me here are the result of years of searching, and they only barely function. I'll be shocked if they make it through this shoot, to be honest. And since nobody's made any replacement parts in almost 20 years, I've realized that this may be the last chance I have to document some of this stuff. So I'm just gonna go to war with the army I have. Still though, I really can't overstate how unqualified I am. I wasn't there when any of the stuff I'll be discussing was in vogue. I certainly never used it for work, at least before last week. I can't even find manuals for a lot of this stuff. I had to teach myself the rudiments through sheer trial and error. So this is really gonna be the basics. But maybe that's a good thing, because if I covered the whole topic, you'd probably lose interest. Like, okay, you know how we still call gas unleaded, even though you haven't been able to get anything else for decades outside of an airport? That's because we were using the leaded stuff for 50 years before we started to switch away from it, and it took even longer to get rid of it entirely. And in fact, we haven't, since we're still using it in piston aircraft. So up until very recently, we'd spent more time using leaded gas than not. And the same is true for linear video editing. It goes back to the very beginning of video recording as a technology, so there were many different techniques and approaches, and I intend to show you just one of them, and to do so in a completely half-assed manner, but that's probably all you'd really want to see anyway, and it sure beats knowing nothing. So, let's go for it. I think the best place to start is with some prehistory, and that is the right word because videotape is really old. I actually made a documentary a couple years ago about the early days of consumer video, and I recommend you check that out if you want more details. But as far as industry goes, the first experiments with videotape happened all the way back in the early 50s, and the first usable format was 1956's quadruplex, quad for short. Now, I just so happen to have some quad here, and that's good, both because quad was really historically important, and also because you really have to see it to get how funny it is. Let me explain. If you remember videotapes, chances are you're thinking of VHS, and those seemed pretty big, but the actual tape itself is only about ½ an inch wide, or around 1.2 centimeters. The same was true for Betamax, they're pretty much the same format. And that was honestly pretty microscopic for the era, if you consider that the industry standard cassette format, the one used by broadcasters at the time these came out, was U-matic. And this stuff was 3/4 of an inch wide, or about 2 centimeters. U-matic tapes are themselves pretty funny to look at, but quadruplex is a laugh riot. This tape is 2 whole inches wide, and boy howdy, this is gonna sticky shed like hell when somebody tries to play it. that doesn't sound great. Anyway, this is about 5 centimeters, or 4 times the width of VHS, and this is comical in itself, but it's even funnier to see someone flapping the stuff around like a length of garden hose, and fortunately, that used to be an integral part of the editing process. Up until videotape came around, all pre-recorded TV shows were edited the same way movies were because they were movies. In the early 50s, if you wanted to delay a program for later broadcast or modify it in any way, your only real option was to shoot it on film, or to use a kinescope to convert the TV camera image to film. And at that point, you'd edit the program the same way people have been editing movies since they were invented, with a razor blade and tape. To remove an unwanted piece of footage, you'd simply slice the film strip in the dead space between frames, take out the part you don't want, and then join the ends together with adhesive tape. This, by the way, is where we get a lot of film terminology from, like referring to deleted parts of a movie as being on the cutting room floor. You know, the floor of the room where you do the cut. And that term in itself referred to literally cutting the film, like with a knife. It's also where footage comes from, you know, the thousands of feet of film used to store a moving picture. And a film clip is a piece of footage that's literally been clipped. Are you getting it? It's all literal. Everything was literal. Anyway, this practice of razor blade splicing did not carry over to video editing for the most part, for a whole mix of reasons, not the least of which is that it's incredibly tedious and fairly limiting. And I think that most formats demanded so much precision that it just wasn't practical. But I say for the most part, because for the first few years of Quad's existence, it actually was edited that way. As you can see in this late 60s BBC training film, which I think I've cited in 3 or 4 other videos already. It's really the gift that keeps on giving. As far as anybody could tell, this film seems to be from about 1968, and it demonstrates just how barbarian the process used to be. To remove a piece of video footage, they would first apply a magnetic developer to the tape. That's a chemical that actually made the stripes of magnetic signal on the tape visible to the naked eye. And since Quad was so damn primitive, those tracks were actually big enough that you could interact with them by hand. They'd put the tape under a microscope, align a mark between 2 fields of video, and then just slice the tape with a razor blade, take out the unwanted portion, and stick the good parts together with splicing tape, the same way you would with film. So this is all interesting trivia, I'm sure, but why am I telling you all about this process that I won't be demonstrating in this video? Well, it's because, fundamentally, it's linear. Tape is what we would now call a sequential access medium. Now, these are essentially a dead technology nowadays, except for the people using LTO at corporations, but we don't talk about them. Nowadays, we're all pretty much used to random access media like hard drives and SSDs, where you can read any byte from any location with almost no difference in speed, no matter how far apart they are. I mean, hard drives do have seek times, but they're negligible at a human timescale, and they can be mitigated in various ways, like with RAID. With tape, on the other hand, seek times are obscenely long and impossible to mitigate. Suppose you're playing a video from quadruplex. That was usually recorded at about 15 inches per second. So in 1 second, that much goes by the head. But if you want to move forward by 2 minutes, that means you've got to wind 150 feet of tape off of one reel and onto another, 1 inch at a time. You can try to wind it faster, fast forward, if you will, but it can only go so fast before the tape doubles over and tangles itself up. And there is simply no way to skip instantly from one spot to another one that's much further inside. You have to pay your dues. So while tape may be wrapped onto spools, the way you interact with it is as a very long straight line, where your only options are to move forward or back. And this one-dimensional motion is what we call linearity. So the reason I explained the razor blade editing technique is that it's the simplest, most fundamental way to interact with a linear medium. But it was also a huge pain in the ass with tons of limitations, so it was retired as soon as possible. The technique that replaced it is the one I'll be showing you today, and it's one that was ubiquitous for so long that I'd never actually heard a specific term for it before. It's just how things were done since long before I was born. Since there was a time, however, when people edited with stone knives and bearskins, I figured they must have had a word for this when it was new, and lo and behold, they did. The phrase is electronic dub editing, or just dub editing. And that's a pretty good term for it. If you weren't around for the cassette tape era, you might not know the word dub. And I'm actually not positive on the etymology, but at least one source says it's an abbreviation for double. That sounds about right, so we'll go with it. At any rate, though, almost anyone who owned a cassette deck in their heyday probably dubbed a tape at some point. It's the whole purpose of the medium for a lot of people. The idea is you get yourself 2 tape decks, and you plug an extension cord in between them. We take the speaker out from this one and feed it to the mic input on this one. Then we get ourselves a couple of tapes. We'll need a source tape, something with some music on it, and then a blank to record onto. We put our blank into one deck, and our original in another. And now you just hit record on one while you hit play on the other. And that's it. You just let this setup cook until the first tape runs out. Then you stop it, you flip them both over and do it again. And you end up with a complete copy of the original tape minus a bit of analog distortion. In other words, you'll have doubled it. But nothing says you have to dub an entire tape. You can hit stop whenever you like to end up with a partial copy. And this is what gave us the mixtape. Now, that's just as easy. You put the blank in your recorder, you put your tape in your source, you hit play, and when the first track is finished playing, you stop it, you take it out, and then you get another tape from maybe a different band or a different album or whatever. You cue that up to the track you want, and then you hit record and play. And when you're done, you've got two different songs on the same tape, and you repeat this till the tape is full. Now, this is an example of dub editing, but I might as well point out that it's also a great example of editing in general. Nowadays, we're so used to the incredible power of software that we conflate a lot of ideas together into edit. To edit a video in 2025 means to start with raw footage and end with a finished work full of animated transitions, special effects, text overlays, a soundtrack, the works. But for nearly a century, editing moving pictures referred almost entirely to two very simple acts. One was to remove parts of raw footage that were undesirable, either due to mistakes or because you changed your mind about them, and the other was to rearrange what remained to create a desired narrative or experience. These basic steps are what people were accomplishing with razors and tape in the 60s. You removed the tape you didn't want and arranged what remained into a pleasing configuration. But there's one crucial difference between razor blades and dub editing. The latter is non-destructive. Nothing goes on the cutting room floor. Once you finish making a mixtape, you've still got your original, pristine and untouched. So if you don't like what you made, you could just rewind, erase the mixtape, and try again. Obviously, this was a huge upgrade, especially for professionals, and it was ubiquitous for much longer than the razor blade approach. All the same though, editing video in the early days before special effects and computer graphics became universal still referred mostly to what we now call the cut stage, those two basic steps of removing and recombining footage. And if you're paying attention, you might realize this is really no different than making a mixtape. Indeed, a lot of untrained amateurs did do basic video editing with nothing more than a pair of ordinary consumer VCRs. Plenty of enthusiastic gadget dads edited down their vacation videos at home. There was even dedicated equipment for that purpose, but that's a story for another time. Although it does give me a pretty nice segue because, well, this is where video editing would end up eventually. If you are just some amateur at home making mixtapes for your friends, then doing it the way I showed you, pressing all these buttons over and over, that works just fine. But if you're a serious professional, you're going to want something a bit more sophisticated than that. And indeed, the people doing audio mixing at the time had much more sophisticated equipment. And the same is true for video. Soon after dub editing came into existence, much of the work was offloaded to computers. And obviously I don't mean PCs here, those didn't even exist when this idea was new, but rather dedicated purpose-built devices called edit controllers. This is technically one of those, but it's not one that was really intended for pros. I do, however, have several specimens that were. First is this one, which you saw at the beginning of the video. And second, we've got this guy here. Now, these are from the late 80s and early 90s, but the concept is pretty dang old. I don't know when the first ones came out, but the basic design goes back to at least the early 70s. One of the earliest I can find good pictures of is this Ampex Beast from 1979. And the first thing you'll notice is that it's absolutely gigantic compared to even the stuff I have on the set here. But a lot of tape gear was back then. And that one could actually be made even bigger with the addition of the Ampex EDM-1, a gargantuan computer console, switcher, and special effects generator all rolled into one, which added God knows what capabilities to this thing, and probably cost more than a Navy battleship. But the elements we're interested in here are actually on the main unit itself. And without even having touched one of these things, I could tell you the basics. That screen, for instance, that's a timecode display that tells you where you are on a tape in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. And if we look at this, hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Likewise, the buttons that say assemble and insert are also found on this gadget 14 years later. Assemble, insert. And to the left of the screen, there's a knob labeled shuttle, and that goes from reverse to forward. And would you look at that? Shuttle, reverse, forward. So again, the concepts didn't change for a really long time because the act didn't change for a long time. The entire purpose of that gigantic machine from the 70s was to automate the process of making a mixtape. All the sophistication, All the circuitry, all the buttons and knobs add up to a machine that does little more than pressing play on one recorder while pressing record on another. And yet, these devices were incredibly important. Electronic edit controllers basically represented a maturing of the video industry, the same way that the Intel 386 represents the beginning of the modern era of computing. Next to a PC from even 1996, it's laughably unsophisticated, but compared to the PCs and XTs in use throughout most of the 80s, a 386 is closer to what we have now than to what we had then. Likewise, while editing with these things is, spoiler, an absolute joke if you're used to Adobe Premiere, even the earliest ones were a vast improvement over razors and tape. Enough of an improvement that the process really didn't change for decades. What did change, of course, is that they made them much, much smaller. So while I'd love to show you a 1979 Ampex AVR3, I think you'll get the picture from the stuff that's new enough to fit on my set. Now, I'd love to tell you that these things are what the real pros used once upon a time, but I'll be frank, it's really hard for me to tell what the market segments were in retrospect. I mean, some of it's obvious, right? This one was absolutely intended for amateurs. It was intended for dads, really, but also, I guess, really budget-oriented wedding videographers. But as far as these things go, would they have been used by MTV and ESPN or just to make small-town local programming and golf instructional videos? I really have no idea. What's important is they're the ones I have. The one from Sony here, this is from 1988. This is called the RM450. And the other is made by Panasonic. This is from 92. It's called the AG-A770. Now, your first impression of these is probably, wow, those look really similar. And you'd be right, because despite being released 4 years apart by two different companies, these are not only extremely close in design and function, they even use compatible interface protocols, something I assumed was not the case for like 2 years, and which almost ruined this video, but that's another story. Of these two, however, I definitely prefer the Panasonic. It looks cooler, it works better, and it actually has one really important feature that the Sony doesn't. I only had both of these here to illustrate how similar they were, so I will set the Sony aside and focus on this one. Now, while earlier editors were built into the decks they controlled, by the time this came out, the two functions of editing and playback and recording were decidedly separate. So you bought an edit controller, and then you bought a pair of tape decks to control with it. So we'll need to talk about those next, but first, a point of order. The right term for a professional videotape recorder is VTR. Now, most people know the term VCR, meaning video cassette recorder, and that's because widespread video usage among consumers kicked off with Beta and VHS, two cassette-based formats. The broadcast industry, however, started out on open reel formats like quadruplex and Type C, for which the term was video tape recorder, or VTR, because there was no cassette, so they wouldn't have called it that. And pros didn't switch entirely over to cassettes for over 30 years, so the older term stuck hard. It's actually still in use today, even for digital video players. So that's what I'll be calling these, even though they do use cassettes. Deal with it. Now, the specific VTRs that I've chosen is a strong term, this is what I could get. These are Sony UVW 1800s. They shoot on the Betacam SP format, and I'm really glad I was able to get a pair of working units because these are exactly what you'd expect to find in a serious editing bay. Again, that's not to say they're top of the line. I actually found someone on Usenet calling them the Kleenex of Betacam, but I think that's sort of the point. This is, indeed, and by far, the most common Betacam deck I've seen on the used market, and I've also seen them in a lot of behind-the-scenes tours at TV stations and whatnot, because these were among the cheaper decks you could get. That is, of course, all relative. The MSRP was around $8,000 in '94. That'd be about 16 grand in today's money. But at that price, any serious operation could afford to buy a few of them. And yet, they are very nice. These decks are extremely well built, they are very heavy, and they're very precise. They offer frame-accurate editing, which means that, in short, all their operations are perfect. And really, everything about them just reeks of above and beyond. For instance, you may have noticed that the front panel displays are shockingly readable, even compared to typical VFDs. They use big, bold fonts so you can make out the timecode display very clearly. But on top of that, there's a complete menu system available through these displays, and despite only having room for one line of text, it is remarkably pleasant to navigate. Which is funny because you should never have to. The menu is also provided on one of the two video outputs. There's a clean feed output for dubbing, and then a second one for the editor, which superimposes an on-screen display, provides timecode, status, etc., and a complete graphical menu. It even offers step-by-step guidance for maintenance operations. If the machine detects a misfed tape, for instance, a frequent occurrence on this poor old machine, the emergency eject process walks you through opening the machine, ensuring the tape isn't caught on anything, then slowly unthreading and ejecting it one step at a time, asking yes/no questions throughout the process to ensure that your precious original footage doesn't get mangled. And, not to overstate the matter, it also uses Betacam. Now, if you aren't familiar, the Betacam SP tape format was the lingua franca of pro video and everyday broadcasting for about 25 years, despite being essentially just an upgraded version of the consumer format, Betamax. In fact, the tapes are identical, which is kind of a bad thing, because if you put a Max tape in a cam deck or vice versa, you'll trash the heads. That's because Betacam tapes are exclusively made with metal particle formulation, like high-end audio tapes, while Max used cheaper ferric oxide coatings. This gives Betacam a lot more bandwidth, so it can offer a much higher resolution picture. It also stores video in component instead of composite format, and it moves considerably faster than Betamax. While the consumer format was poo-pooed at its release time for only packing in an hour of footage max, Betacam does even worse. It tops out at just 30 minutes. Now, of course, this isn't a huge problem if you're just editing together some commercials or a TV news package, but obviously there are times when you need more runtime than that. So it's fortunate that Betacam also comes in large. These extremely funny tapes were available up to about 90 minutes. That's still not long enough to fit in a copy of Titanic, but good enough for their intended purpose, especially since what you get in exchange for runtime was some of the best quality possible in the analog era. Not the best, but more than good enough for government work. Consequently, though, these were some of the cheapest decks in existence, yet they still cost more than a used car. Now, you certainly didn't need gear this nice. You could edit on much lower end equipment. I actually have a Panasonic unit that cost about half as much as these because it records on SVHS tape. I also used to own a pair of very similar looking units that took Hi8, the consumer camcorder format. And yet these were all pro models, and they would actually work with the gear I have here. You wouldn't find either of those, however, in like a TV news studio, and that tends to be where my head goes. Anyone who was serious, and a lot of people who weren't, was using Betacam. That's actually not true. There were a lot of studios that were stuck on U-matic for a very long time just because they'd invested so much in the gear and the media. But if you were setting up a new studio, ideally, you'd have Betacam. Anyway, having introduced my gear, now all we have to do is plug it all together. The edit controller here, this is actually just a remote. It's got a 20-foot cable that plugs into a box back here. This is actually a whole computer. This is where all the logic lives. And then that thing has a couple serial ports on the back, which plug into matching ports on the VTRs. Then I set both of these decks to remote mode, and that actually disables all the front panel controls. It just says remote when I try to do anything. So the controller here is in charge of the whole show. And now we're ready to edit. That was a lie. We have a lot more setup to do. Okay, the first question is, what will we edit? I had to think really hard about this because I wanted to do a good demo. I didn't want to just dink around, press a few buttons and show you a feature or two in a vacuum. I don't think that would really give you the right idea. We need to see how this would actually be used to produce a product. So I decided to make a show within a show. The other day I came in and I shot a video. I found a random gewgaw sitting around the studio that I thought was kind of neat. I wrote a short script for it and I shot it just as if it were any normal production. The catch is that I used an old analog camera plugged into this deck here, and I recorded the whole shoot onto one of these comical 90-minute tapes. And unfortunately, I did it over composite instead of component, so the quality isn't what it could be, but well, the deed is done, so we'll have to live with it. Once I shot the main video, I then got some B-roll shots, which I recorded on a separate tape, one of these guys. And finally, I edited it all together using the exact system you see here. The result is a video which, while short, is still basically complete. I probably could have released it on my main channel if I didn't want a whole bunch of angry and confused comments about the quality. Since you already know what's going on though, I'm just gonna run it right now so you can see the finished product, and then I'll show you how I made it. A while back, I found something that looks boring is boring, but still has two weird little details that I felt like sharing. This is the thing, and honestly, it's nothing more than it appears to be. It's just an extension cord with a 4-outlet splitter on the end. It is a pretty old one, to be fair. I'm not sure exactly when it was made. I'd guess somewhere between the 20s and the 50s, just based on the styling and materials. It's definitely made out of Bakelite, which I don't think I've seen in an outlet splitter before, so that was a little novel, but it was also the most popular plastic in the world for several decades, so I'm sure this isn't too rare. What caught my eye about it, though, was the modular design. If we grab the top here and just pull, it pops apart to reveal an outlet underneath. This is actually a single outlet extension cord with a 4-outlet splitter that plugs in on top of it. Now, I could see some logic to this design. The idea of being able to extend a wall outlet to the middle of a room in the form of an upright facing socket, so you can just lean down and plug something in temporarily, isn't a bad one. I mean, you could spill a drink in it, but that's true of all power strips even now. So maybe this was imagined as a dual-use product. You buy it as a simple extension cord with a weighted base, then you can turn it into a 4-way splitter if you want. But I see two problems with this. The first is that the base isn't complete. The top is just a piece of paperboard covering up the exposed conductor, so it's clearly not meant to be used on its own. But also, if we flip it over, on the bottom, it proudly advertises itself as the foursome. So obviously, this was sold as a 4-outlet splitter. Why does it separate in the middle? I have no idea. Information about this thing online is scarce, so your guess is as good as mine. I should mention that I could be giving them too much benefit of the doubt here. The end of the plug is also paperboard, so maybe they did think this was an acceptable insulator, but what would be the point? I mean, if it shipped with the 4-outlet splitter, as the name suggests, then why remove it? I mean, if you're worried about overloads, just don't plug the other 3 in, right? So yeah, I got nothing on this. There's one other curious thing, though, which you may have noticed on the bottom. This was made and sold by the Colt Repeating Arms Company. This was literally made by a gun manufacturer who even advertised it as being made of genuine Colt rock. What's Colt rock? Nobody's quite sure, but it's probably just Colt's name for their formulation of Bakelite. While that term was a trademark belonging to the General Bakelite Company, similar phenolic plastics were made by many different companies with many different choices of filler and sold under 1,000 names. Colt apparently had a whole division dedicated to making plastic objects of all sorts, like makeup containers and tobacco humidors, which sounds wacky, but the early 20th century was an absolute goldmine of plastics speculation. Everyone who could get in on the fun did, and while we can guess that Colt probably started doing this in the pursuit of plastic furniture for firearms like forearms and pistol grips, it's no surprise that they might have branched out. There's probably no small number of electrical devices out there with the Colt name on them, lamps and who knows what else. But given the significant chance that they all contain huge quantities of asbestos, I don't think I'm going to get into the collector's market anytime soon. Anyway, that's all there is to say about it, so thanks for watching. All right, I hope that was fun. The fun is over now, though. It's time to get to work. Obviously, that video was very simple compared to my usual stuff. There were no superimposed images, no on-screen text, no chroma keyed background, but it's tightly edited. There's close-ups inserted at critical moments to better illustrate my points, and there are no apparent errors, even though I did make mistakes while shooting. I flubbed my lines several times and had to do retakes. It's a 4-outlet extension cord. Oops, let's do it again. And there are some moments of dead air. And I even coughed once or twice. Goldmine of plastic speculation. Whoops, let's do that again. The value of removing those errors and of adding the close-up shots far outweighs on-screen text and graphics. So I'm gonna call this system good enough for my basic needs. So let's start looking at how it works. In a basic editing rig, you need at least 2 VTRs. One is the player that holds our original tape. That's the source footage that came out of the camera, which is not this one. These are backwards. This goes here, this goes here. And then the other is the record deck. This holds the blank tape, again called a master, on which we'll be assembling our finished product. Now, the tape I'm gonna be using is extremely funny, so I'm gonna take a moment and show it to you. You see this 5M here? That's not an arbitrary model number. This is a 5-minute cassette There's almost no tape on the reels, and that's very deliberate. Metal particle tapes were very expensive in their day, so if this were 1993, I'd have a strong incentive to buy only as much as I needed and no more. So they sold cassettes in a variety of lengths. 30 minutes was the longest, but they also made 20 and 10 and 5. Now, since I have extensive experience scripting and planning shoots, I knew before I even shot this that the final product would be less than 5 minutes long, so I knew this tape would be adequate, so I went with that. It also would have held, a couple TV commercials or channel bumpers or whatever, so I'm sure they sold plenty of these, which is why I found an entire stack of them at the Goodwill. Anyway, I'm gonna pop this in my recorder here, and then I'm gonna do something very curious before I proceed. I just got this tape out of the box, so it's completely blank as it came from the factory, and I'm going to immediately start recording nothing onto it. The deck is not receiving a picture right now, but I'm just gonna record that empty image all the way to the end of the tape before we continue. This will take a while, about 5 minutes. Okay, the blinking tape icon there means we're getting towards the end of the tape. All right, there we go. That just finished, so the deck's rewinding, and I will tell you why I did all that later. For now, we're almost ready to get started, but I'm gonna have to put on headphones for the rest of the video so I can hear the audio from my source tape, and really hoping that doesn't mess up my hair too much. Okay, I think we're good. The one other thing I should do before we proceed is give you a warning, because the rest of this video from here on out is going to contain bright, flickering images and some loud, abrasive sounds here and there, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's just the way the process is. So if that's a problem for you, I recommend you bow out now, or at least skip to the wrap-up segment. But now we can meet our edit controller, and I know it looks intimidating, but much like I said in my video on video mixers, it really isn't as complicated as it looks, especially because a lot of the controls are duplicates. These ones, for instance, play, stop, fast forward, etc. These are just copies of the same controls on the front of the player deck, and the set on the other side is the same for the recorder. Usually your VTRs would be in a rack, not necessarily within reach, so the controller just brings all the buttons together in one place for convenience. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit play on the player to find the beginning of my source footage. Okay, we got something here. And then I'm just going to advance my recorder until I see the time code going up. Okay, looks like we're good there. So everything seems to be working at this point. My decks are not broken, at least so far. We're almost ready to start editing, but one more quick aside. Now that we have pictures from both our decks, you can see the video feeds up here. This one goes to this deck, this one goes to this one. Here's the trouble though. The recorder is on your left, but it's on my right. So when the camera shows my perspective of the edit controller, the images have to swap places versus here. That's kind of confusing, but I couldn't figure out a solution, so I guess we'll just have to grit our teeth and get through it together. Anyway, so let's review our controls. The basics are obvious. Like I said, we got play, stop, rewind, fast forward. One odd thing though, there's no pause button. Betacam decks don't have pause buttons. Or more accurately, they don't have what we would usually call stop. Maybe you've never used a VCR, you might not know the difference. So stop on a consumer machine means stop the tape, unthread it from the mechanism, spin down the video head. Pause means stop moving the tape, but leave it threaded, wrapped around the video head, and keep the head spinning. Pause is used to freeze the image on the screen, as we've done here, so you can study a still frame. But the other reason is to stop playback very briefly. Suppose you're watching a movie and you want to pause just long enough to answer a question, like 3 or 4 seconds. If you hit stop on your remote, the deck is going to spend 5 to 10 seconds unthreading the tape, putting it back into the cassette. And when you want to resume, you'll have to wait 5 seconds for it to thread back up again. There's also no guarantee that you'll land at the exact spot where you left off. The tape might slide a bit to either side. Pause doesn't have those problems. You can start and stop almost instantly, and there's very little drift. The problem, of course, is that when the tape is paused, the head is still spinning. That's what's going on right now. Both these tapes are frozen in place, but the head is just grinding against the tape, and that's putting wear on the head and the tape. So eventually this will actually damage the tape, and thus in a consumer VCR, you can often only pause for a minute or two before the machine automatically puts itself in stop to prevent damage. This is, of course, important because, consumers spend a lot on tapes. At least back in the day, you might spend $60 to buy a copy of Lethal Weapon. You didn't want to ruin it. And if you rented it, the rental store certainly didn't want you leaving it paused until it wore through the tape. With Betacam, on the other hand, This is not nearly as important as productivity. You're expected to be working as long as the machine is running. Long breaks aren't very likely. If a tape is in the machine, it's assumed that you're actively editing it, and time is money, so you don't want to wait for threading and unthreading. So the stop button does what pause would do on a consumer VTR. It just freezes the tape in place but keeps the image on the screen. And the only time the tape unthreads is if you leave the deck sitting idle for like 10 minutes. It assumes that you went to get a coffee and unthreads the tape. Other than that, though, this is a pretty normal set of playback controls, and the only remarkable thing is that there's no record button over here. There's one over here, but not there. And that's because, well, the player here can record, but this is my precious, irreplaceable original footage, all right? And while Betacam tapes actually have very nice resettable write protect switches, you can toggle back and forth like a floppy disk, everybody makes mistakes. So it makes sense to just not provide a record button on that side so you can't have a tragedy. But below the basic playback controls, we have the core editing controls, and these are much more important. This is where the magic happens. We've got the jog shuttle dial and the mark in and mark out buttons. You'll be pleased to know right off the bat that the big knob is exactly as important as it looks. In fact, it's actually two knobs in one. If I give this a spin, well, it doesn't exactly spin freely, but you can see it goes all the way around indefinitely, and that's because it's in jog mode. And this moves the tape very, very slowly, less than a frame at a time. In fact, the big gray break in the middle of the video, that's the blanking area between two video frames, and I can actually move that back and forth fairly smoothly. There's like 5 or 6 steps in between each frame, and you can also see that the frame counter up here is on 21. And then we have to get this all the way to the bottom before it goes to 22. To be clear, that means the deck is moving the tape millimeters back and forth with absolute precision, perfectly mirroring my hand motion in either direction. Did I mention this deck cost $8,000? So jog mode is obviously for super precision work, but there's a second mode to this knob for medium precision work. If we press this button, it pops up and that engages a clutch internally, which turns it into a shuttle control. Unfortunately, because of the poor health of my decks here, I actually have to swap tapes to demo this. I'll explain why in a moment. All right, so my source tape, my original footage is in the recorder here. And if I now turn the shuttle, we start advancing at very low speed. That's 0.06 of normal playback rate. And then we go to a 1/10. And then a little bit faster. Now we're at about 1/3 speed. Now we're at 3/4 speed. Then we go to 1.5x. So we're fast forwarding a little bit. And then 3x. And we hop all the way up to 13x. And then we hit a hard stop. The knob won't go any faster. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it goes to 16x. Wow, I thought it topped out at 13, but there's another notch there I hadn't noticed. This, by the way, is why I switched machines. The player has some mechanical issues. It works fine up until about 3.5x. And if I go any faster, it drops the tape like a bike chain. Then I gotta open it up and untangle it and everything. This one, on the other hand, as you can see, goes all the way up to warp speed with no problem. This is particularly inconvenient because if I just habitually hit rewind or fast forward, it immediately chucks the tape and I've got to take the thing to pieces. So the power of this interface should be pretty obvious. I can advance as fast as I need to find a scene that I'm looking for, and then as I approach it, I can slow down, creep up on it, and then stop, switch to jog mode, and dial in the exact frame that I want, all without ever lifting my hand. And this is such a universal desire given the intrinsically linear nature of video that despite being a design from the late 60s, these are still in use today. Not everyone still uses a linear editor style control like this, but I do sometimes. This is from Blackmagic Design. I bought this like a year ago to use with DaVinci Resolve, the NLE that I do all my modern work in. And there's similar controllers for pretty much every NLE in history. So it's not a universal thing. Some people just use mice these days, but if you want it, it still makes sense. So now that we know how to navigate, we can actually start editing. The first thing we're going to do is pick the first clip that will appear in our finished video. Now, if I'd had any false starts, then I'd have to skip over the first couple takes to get to the first good one, but I happen to remember that I nailed the first paragraph of the script in one go, so I just need to find the spot where I start talking.
A while back.
Okay, there's the first words. Now we back up just a little bit. That's where I started. Now we're going to give it another like half second of breather here. All right, I think that's about where we want to start it. So I'm going to hit mark in, and notice that the in point on the player side comes on. That means that the exact point indicated by the timecode up here is saved in memory. So if we scrub forward a little bit, a while back I found something, and then I hold down go to and press in, it's going to back up to that exact spot that I saved. So that's the beginning of our first clip, but now we need to pick the end, so I'm going to advance until I find the moment where I made my first mistake. Okay, I think it was right around here. It's nothing more than it appears to be. Yeah, there it is. That's about where I messed up. So we're going to back up to the words, here's the thing. This is the thing. This is the thing. Well, anyway, so that's it. So I'm going to back up to just before that. And I should point out, audio is recorded on tape of this era the same way as on normal audio tape. So you got to get used to hearing yourself in both helium voice and slow motion. Anyway, I think this is the right spot. So I'm going to hit mark out, and now both in and out are lit up, and that means that our first clip is fully selected. And so we could, at this point, copy that clip to the master tape to begin the proper editing of the video. But again, there's a little bit of setup first. There's always a bit more setup, isn't there? Okay, so the in and out buttons are lit up on the player side, but there's nothing on the recorder side. I'm going to show you some really interesting things you can do with the recorder in and out later, but what's important now is we can't start editing until we pick an in point for the recorder. Otherwise, the editor doesn't know where you want to start laying down the dub. So let's just rewind our master tape to the very beginning. Okay, and we'll hit mark in. And now we're ready to do our first edit, to actually copy something from the source to the master. But since that's irreversible, once it's done, we want to be sure that we got it right. So we're going to hit preview, and that'll show us roughly what this edit will look like without actually doing it. So we hit that button, both decks start rolling, and then something has gone wrong. On my Sony editor, we'd actually get like a big ugly error message. This one, however, just stops and it doesn't tell you why. Don't worry, for once nothing's broken. All we have to do to fix this is wind the master tape forward a few seconds. There we go, and we'll mark in there instead. I'll explain why we had to do that in a minute. First, let's hit the preview, and make sure you watch closely because a lot is going to happen all at once. I press preview, both decks say pre-roll as they rewind, now they stop, now both say play. Whatever. The beep means it's recording. Looks boring, is boring, but still has two weird little details that I felt like sharing. The second beep means it stopped, and that's that. Now that sure was a whirlwind of activity. Here's what it all meant. During pre-roll, the decks rewind to a point several seconds before where they need to start the edit. This is because, despite all the bloviating I did about their incredible precision, the frame-perfect editing and all that, the mechanism is just too big and heavy to get going instantly from a dead stop. So whenever a tape begins moving, it takes a moment for it to get up to a stable speed and for the heads to synchronize the rotation to the tape. If the record deck tried to start recording from exactly the point I picked, then the servos would wobble just a tiny bit as the tape started moving and the image would get distorted. So to avoid this, both decks have to get a running start. This is called pre-roll. The controller rewinds the VTRs to a few seconds before the desired start point, hits play on both, and by the time the two decks reach the edit, the motors have stabilized and the decks can be absolutely certain where they are. Then, as the heads cross the point where the desired clip should start, the recorder switches on the record head, which it can do with perfect timing because there's no mechanical element to it, just a semiconductor turning on. Then when it reaches the end of the edit, it shuts off the record head, and that's that. So the edit kicks in and out at exactly the points you want. And to be clear, pre-roll is not a sign of low quality. Everything needed it, even top-of-the-line hardware. But the amount of pre-roll did vary from device to device. Controllers let you change the length. Mine is set to 5 seconds by default, but it can go up to as much as 10. And I have to assume that's only for like VHS units or like really old clapped out decks. In any case though, this is why it wouldn't let me record from the very beginning of the tape. There was no room to back up and get a running start. So I had to move forward by a few seconds so it would have that runway. This only matters at the beginning of the tape. Of course, once you lay down your first edit, every subsequent clip is going to be tacked on to the end of that one, so you'll have breathing room from there on. Anyway, nothing's actually been recorded yet. So I could make adjustments if I wanted to before committing this. Suppose I felt the clip was too long. I could go to the out point and then I could dial it back just a little bit, and I could hit mark out again, and that would shorten it. Then I hit preview to see how that looks and repeat until I'm happy with what I see. In this case, though, I feel pretty good about it, so we're ready to actually do it. We're gonna hit the big red edit button. That's gonna do all the same things we just saw, but this time it'll actually count. We rewind, we pre-roll, we're playing. There's the edit. That means it's actually recording. All right, and that's it. We're done. That was actually for real. You may have noticed the rec light on the deck coming on, so we know that dub actually happened. And if we want to be absolutely sure, we can now hit review to replay the segment that we just copied. A while back, I found something that looks boring. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'd like to point something out here. Timecode is kind of complicated. I'll talk more about it later, but you may notice that this says there's 2 hours, 32 minutes, and 15 seconds on this 5-minute tape. For some reason, timecode generators often don't start at 0. I don't know why this is, but it's just a common thing. I think you can reset it. I don't know how to. But in any case, my tape's timecode starts at about 2:32:10. So I went forward 5 seconds and 10 frames when I hit the mark in button. It doesn't really matter. That's just where I decided to start it. But here's the thing. Having laid down this edit, if we now walk back, you'll see that at 15 seconds and 9 frames, there is nothing. At 15 and 10, that's where our video begins. So when I told it to start at this frame, it started at exactly this frame. Did I mention these things cost $8,000 a piece? Anyway, that's one edit down. Time for our next clip. Now, if I were on that Sony controller that I briefly held up earlier, the process for the second clip would just be a repeat of what we did for the first. I'd pick another set of ins and outs, preview it, adjust them if desired, then hit edit when I'm happy, and so on until we've built up the entire rough cut. And don't get me wrong, that is the ultimate goal here, but doing it exactly like that is kind of tedious. Having already edited this the other day, I can tell you this video will end up being about 6 separate clips. So that's 6 repetitions of find a clip, mark in and out, wait for it to dub over, find another clip, mark in and out, and so on. Each time you have to wait while it does its thing, your mind wandering as you lose steam and forget what you were doing. And since we're doing this all incrementally, it makes the decision making harder. As I progress through this video, I'm going to do edit after edit, copying each one to the tape. But what if I get to edit number 4 and I start to think, oh man, I forgot I did this scene. You know, if shot number 2 had been just a little bit longer, it would have included, you know, this bit that would have led well into this. But I forgot about that. Well, shit, because it's too late. You already dubbed those scenes over, so your only real option is to wipe the tape, go back, and redub everything again. This sucks, and it's bad enough for a 3-minute project, but if the final product was 40 minutes, that'd be a lot of wasted effort there. On this controller, however, we have a huge luxury that lets us avoid that. You see this little display that says Event? This is the very important feature that the Sony lacked. This controller can hold multiple edits in memory at once. That means you can select as many clips as you like, preview them as many times as you like, and adjust them however you like, all before actually committing anything to the master tape. And then even once you do produce a finished dub, if you find errors, it's much easier to repeat the whole process after you correct them. So, for instance, having finished our first cut, we can hold the event button and advance to event number 2, and you'll see that these lights mostly go out, so it's forgotten our ins and outs. So now we'll advance until the second take. This is the thing. Okay, here we go. That's the end of the previous take, the beginning of the next. So let's just walk this back. Okay, this is where I started doing the second take. So I'm going to mark in here, and then I just play till I hit my next mistake. Which I don't think I've seen in an outlet splitter before, but that would... Okay, there we go. There's a flub. So let's back up to that previous sentence. I'm pretty sure I started the next take on It's Made Out of Bakelite, so we'll look for that. Right about there. So that's the end of the second clip, and I'm going to hit mark out, but you'll notice that the out button didn't light up, and in fact our in light is gone too. This confused the hell out of me for like an hour when I was first learning how to run this thing. Out isn't lit because we aren't on event 2 anymore, we're on event 3. The controller knows that we just made our final decision for that clip, so it made a new event automatically, saving us a couple keystrokes. And that's because this kind of machine is intended for career editors. That sort of optimization is worth it. Once you get good at this job, you can just blaze through a tape, smashing in and out on the fly, and assemble a rough cut almost as quickly as you can review the footage. So every little time saver like this counts, But it's confusing because not only did your in and out points just disappear, but your in point on the recorder is still there. I had to wrap my head around this. When you finish an event, the recorder has an in and an out point where it's going to start and stop recording. Well, the new event is going to start recording at the out point of the previous one, so it just automatically copies the out point to the in point. Did you follow that? Well, either way, that's what it does. So this makes a whole lot of sense once you know what it's doing. It's just really confusing until you do. In any case, though, if I hold event and go back, here's the in and out points for the previous clip. And in fact, even for the first one, the one we already dubbed over there, the machine still remembers it, which is useful if we decide to make changes later, because if we modify this, when we hit the edit button, it'll go ahead and copy it to the tape again. But the editor does remember that we did already dub that. So if I hit edit here, instead of copying event 1, it's going to advance straight to event 2 because it knows that hasn't been dubbed already. So we pre-roll. There's the edit. And honestly, it's nothing more than it appears to be. And there's the end of it. Okay, now we're done. So we now have 2 clips assembled one after another on our master tape. So if we rewind here, there it was. Hit play, and you can see the split where it jumps from one clip to the other. This is, again, frame perfect, so there's no blank spot in the middle, and no frames got overwritten. The 2 clips are placed perfectly back to back. Now, if I'd queued up any more events, it would have gone ahead and copied those 2, which means that I tricked you into sitting through job training again. You just watched the 70-minute instructional video that came with an edit controller you don't even own, and now you have this skill. You can't get that out of your head. It's stuck in there. You're gonna have to go get Eternal Sunshine now. Like, sure, you don't know how to do special effects or transitions or anything, but most TV doesn't deal with those anyway, and in a lot of cases, any effects like that would be added by the Vision Mixer live as the program went out, so the editor would never do anything more than what I just did. This is a perfectly sufficient level of expertise for a lot of old school TV work. The one major gap in your new knowledge is the ability to cut disparate audio and video tracks together, and that is very important, so don't worry, I'll show you that too. The point is though, you now know enough just with those few actions to turn a bunch of footage from a field reporter's camera into a basic news package. And for a lot of people working between, say, the late 70s to mid 2000s, this is what 95% of their job looked like. It is endlessly funny to me that I can get people to sit through training for a job they'll never have. But speaking seriously, at this point, even if you're only used to nonlinear editing, you may have noticed some interesting parallels. These actions are fairly analogous to things you do in Premiere or Final Cut Pro because video is intrinsically linear. So the basic task of assembly is also linear. Here, you're just using a clunkier interface to do it. In something like DaVinci Resolve, you'd start with a big clip. You'd select a subclip from that by choosing in and out points, then drag that onto your timeline. Next, you find another clip and drag that down there, and so on and so forth. Once things are on the timeline, they're more or less assembled into a video, but only virtually. You can preview your edits, and if you don't like them, you just drag the edges of clips around to make tweaks. Nothing is final until you hit render, the big red button, and actually bake the timeline into a finished file. So in concept, this is very similar. We select small clips from a larger source, then we decide where they'll go on the timeline. You have to visualize the timeline in your head, but you get used to that. And then once they're in there, since it's all virtual up to this point, I can treat the source footage the same way I would if it were a file on a hard drive. If I wanted to place an earlier part of the source tape on the master after a later clip, I could do that. The VTR will just go back and get it, no matter where it is. Or I could tell the editor to repeat the same small clip over and over and over, and it'll do that too. Just rewind the source and play back the same segment repeatedly as the recorder records further and further out. And as I mentioned, clips can be moved around on the timeline however you need, as long as they haven't been dubbed yet, and those adjustments can be done very precisely. I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's set up a third event. I'm going to go find the next clip where I don't make any mistakes. Okay, there we go. So when I got to the point where I was pulling the thing apart, I got sort of a false start. Like I started and I couldn't really make it happen. Sometimes that sort of flub is comical, so I'll leave in the mistake. But in this case, I just didn't think it had good comedic timing. So I actually want to cut out the part where I'm struggling with it. So I'm going to put the out point for this clip right after I start pulling on it. Right about there. All right, so we've got clip number 3 selected, but let's go back and take a look at the beginning of it. It's definitely made out of Bakelite. So I actually messed up here and included a little bit of the previous flub. So I need to trim this And I could go to the endpoint, jog it back a little bit, and then mark in again, but I'm an experienced editor, so I can guess that that error is only about 10 frames long. So instead, I can just hold down the endpoint here and then use these plus and minus buttons to walk the edit forward by 10 frames. We play it again. It's definitely made out of... That's much better. So what we've been doing up until now is like dragging the edges of a clip around in DaVinci, but this is like, using the keyboard shortcuts to move it back and forth by a single frame at a time. So you can see how a lot of this compares to a modern editor, and since you've now seen the basics, rather than repeating myself, I'm just going to go ahead and rack up our remaining edits and let the machine print out the rest of the rough cut. So I'll be right back. It pops apart. Which sounds wacky. All right, mark out on the last clip, and I think that's it. So I'm going to hit the big red button, and while that's going, let's chat some more. Obviously, working like this is slower than doing things on an NLE, but it's probably not nearly as awkward and limiting as you might have expected. There is one huge glaring omission, though, that sets this apart from the modern way of doing things. While the Panasonic is building a virtual timeline, and you can preview and adjust bits of it, you can't see the whole thing like you would on a computer. Since it takes time to wind the tape back and forth, you can only see one individual clip at a time. Then the VTR has to take off and find another one before you can actually see it. To see all your decisions in their final context, you have to actually hit the big red button and dub out your edits. Now, this isn't a huge problem with a small project like we have here. At a total runtime of about 3.5 minutes, even adding in the pauses for the VTRs to find their starting points and pre-roll and all, it only takes about 4.5 minutes to render this timeline. So I could just dub out the whole thing, and if I don't like the result, just wipe the master tape, adjust things, and do it all over again. But suppose the final product was an hour long. That would sting a lot more, especially since at that point we'd almost certainly have to work from multiple source tapes in multiple sessions, printing one segment of the project at a time, reviewing it, making tweaks, then moving on to the next. So it would take hours to produce a single master, and only then could you see the whole thing from end to end. Of course, at that point, if there's any errors, you probably have to redo all of that work. It really puts the NLE experience in perspective. This is much easier than I anticipated before I tried it, but only in the way that a brace and bit is easier to use than you probably expect. I mean, you might imagine them being absolutely grueling, especially if you're making the enormous inch plus holes that people often use those things for, but it really isn't all that hard. The huge augers take very big bites, but very slowly. You have a ton of mechanical advantage thanks to the crank, so in softwoods they dig in much quicker than you'd expect. The wood just turns to butter, really, but in the end, you are still yanking your crank. A brace is a very impressive tool, probably surprisingly so if you've never used one, but still, if you have the option of using a big old two-handle electric drill, you're going to take that almost every time, unless you're really concerned with the precision of your work. The difference in effort is night and day, and a brace will never beat a motor in a race. At the same time, though, people built whole cities with braces, so salute as you walk by, okay, kid? And with that, the tapes just stopped spinning, so that means our rough cut is done. Let's go ahead and rewind our recorder, and we'll see how this looks. A while back, I found something. Okay, there's our first clip. Is boring, but still has two weird little details that I felt like sharing. There's our second one. And honestly, it's nothing more than it appears to be. In the styling and materials, it's definitely made. There's our third clip, which I don't think I've seen. Let's see how that cut looks. Here and just pull, it pops apart. Not too bad. A little bit of a jump cut there, but we'll talk more about that later. All right, and this should be the end of our video. So I'm not going to play out the whole thing since you already saw most of it, but take my word, the video is watchable at this point. It's pretty much finished. It's kind of dull, though. It's nothing more than me sitting at a desk talking about this thing, and it's standard def at that, so you can't really see much detail on the artifact. To spruce this up, I want to add some close-ups. I shot those on another tape, so let's eject this. And we'll switch over to another one of these little 5-minute jobs. Okay, here's my B-roll. So we're almost ready to start editing this, but of course, we have to stop first and talk about some theory. I skipped over some critical technical details earlier. It's quite dry, but this information is also vital to the job. And you've been watching long enough that I don't think I need to worry about scaring you off with technobabble. If you were going to leave, you would have already. Up until this point, I've described almost every control on this console, except for, well, like 4, but One is self-explanatory. We've got reset. That's for resetting things. And there's a couple I don't really fully understand myself, like audio split. Apparently this lets you set the in and out points for the audio edit separately from the video. I don't know what that means, and I can't find a manual. So you got me there. Likewise for total, no idea what total does. I don't seem to need it. I've gotten this far without it. But this block up here, I haven't talked about that yet, and I know exactly what this does. As I mentioned earlier, VTRs, since time immemorial, have had these two buttons labeled Assemble or Insert. And so far, we've been working in Assemble mode, as noted by this button. That's typically where video projects start. As the name implies, it's used for assembling clips to make a sequence. But once you have that rough cut done, if you want to make more detailed edits or otherwise modify existing content, you have to switch to Insert mode, which, as the name implies, is for inserting content. But why is this needed? If you remember recording onto VHS back in the day, then this distinction might seem pointless. If you wanted to tape over something, you just taped over it. And we can do that in Assemble mode, but let me show you what that does. I'm gonna pop in another blank so we don't mess up our master. All right, now once again, this tape is 100% empty. So I'm just gonna dub over some content here for us to work with. So we're just gonna record, play. All right, so I just copied about a minute of footage onto this blank tape, and I'm just gonna advance into it like, I don't know, like 10 seconds, something like that. This looks good. And we're gonna mark in here, and then we're gonna go find some footage on our source tape, and we're gonna tell this thing to just copy about, I don't know, like 5 seconds of video right into the middle of what we just dubbed over. There we go. So, okay, we just started writing right into the middle of the existing footage. Okay, that's that. Now let's back up and see how the edit looks. Oh, well, that wasn't ideal. The hell just happened? Well, so most people probably know, or you can infer, that videotapes have separate audio and video tracks. But in reality, there's usually more that you can't see. Pretty much all tapes also have a control track. And in the case of Betacam, there's also a dedicated timecode track. Both are very important for different reasons. The control track, that's simple enough. It's basically an analog signal that helps the VTR stay synchronized and aligned to the tape. The reason our image freaked out is because there was an interruption in that signal. I'll tell you why that was in a minute, but the timecode thing is related and also very important, so I'm going to explain that first. SMPTE timecode is the lingua franca of film, video, and sound editing. As I mentioned earlier, it identifies a specific moment in a video, or a film, or a soundtrack in terms of hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, and it's absolutely ubiquitous. Now, this stuff is useful in a million different ways. For instance, it allows a director looking at a video assist tape on set to write a number on a sheet of paper and hand it to an assistant who takes it to an editor in another building who punches that number into their editing machine, and the exact same frame the director was looking at pops right up in front of them. So it's incredibly useful for communication, but it's also what allows our VTRs to know exactly where they are on a tape. Without timecode, they'd be completely lost, and in some cases, they'll actually refuse to operate. Now, this is a real problem when working with brand new tapes because they come from the factory, again, completely blank. So they have no timecode and no control track. Those need to be created, but your VTR can't know that they're not there. You have to tell it. This is essentially what the Assemble button does. They would have been better off calling it blank tape mode as far as I could tell. In Assemble mode, the VTR assumes the tape is empty, so as it records video and audio, it also lays down new control and timecode tracks created from an internal generator. This seems like it solves the problem, but the timecode will help us see why it isn't a total solution. Let's advance to the end of the recording I made on this tape. So I dubbed over about a minute of footage, and in a moment here we're going to run off the end of it, and you'll see that the timecode stops incrementing. But then I recorded some more footage a couple seconds later, and when we hit that, the timecode starts up again. But pay attention to what happened here. When we reach the end of the first clip, the VTR is moving right now. Like, the tape is going forward, the motors are running, but it doesn't know. It thinks it's still just sitting here. And the spot it thinks it's at is 44 minutes and 11 seconds. But when we hit the beginning of that new footage, it's suddenly 45 minutes and 41 seconds because the internal timecode generator in this thing continued running while I was shuttling around on the other deck, and it picked up where it left off. But that means there's like a minute and 20-second gap in our timecode. Ugh. Because VTRs are so dependent on timecode, they need it to be perfectly continuous, or I think the term is monotonous. It has to always count up, and there can't be any gaps. If there is one, or if there's a time warp where the code suddenly jumps forward like it does here, they can get incredibly confused because, again, this is literally the only way they know where they are. So if the timecode starts violating causality, there's no way to recover. The VTR is just screwed, and after seeking back and forth for a bit, trying to figure out where the hell it is, it'll just give up and throw an error. Well, the same thing is true for the control track, except that while the VTR can read existing timecode and pick up from the same spot when you start a new recording, it can't do that with the control track. Every time you hit record, it lays down a new incompatible signal. Now, you might ask, why doesn't this happen between dubs in an assemble edit like we did earlier? That all looked perfectly clean. And to be honest, I'm not sure I fully understand myself. I think what it is that it only applies at the end of a clip. Like, if a clip stops recording in the middle of existing footage, then it gets messed up. But if it stops recording in the middle of nothing, then it doesn't. But I'm not 100% sure. You'll have to ask somebody else. Honestly, I may have misunderstood the situation completely. This is all just based on crap I read on blogs and old websites. Maybe those people got it wrong too. But either way, it seems like this is a real minefield, and everyone seems to give the same advice for solving it. According to both guys on Usenet and some paper manuals I read from Sony and Panasonic, the right thing to do with a new tape is to unwrap it, then immediately pop it in a deck, hit record, and let it roll all the way to the end, just like I did with that other tape earlier. It doesn't really matter what you record. It's not the picture that matters. It's just the metadata tracks. So what people usually go with is the empty black picture generated from your Studio Genlock source. That's this guy here, which is normally used just as a source of a synchronization signal to make sure everything is generating a picture at the same time, but it also happens to produce an empty image, so you can use it as a video input. This is why many editors refer to this process as blacking a tape, although some refer to it as formatting for probably obvious reasons. And it does bear a very close resemblance to the act of low-level formatting a computer disk, so the name is apt. But even though everyone says to format your tapes, it seems like it doesn't entirely solve the problem anyway, because I found more than one editor who implied that assemble mode is just dangerous, unpredictable, and best avoided entirely. The alternative, they recommend, is insert mode, and that is indeed much safer. In that mode, the VTR only overwrites the audio or video tracks, or a combination thereof. It leaves the control and timecode tracks alone. So let's see that. I'm going to uncheck assemble, and then I'm going to turn on video mode only. I could check A1 and A2 for the audio tracks, but I won't because I'll forget to uncheck that later and it'll mess up our inserts. Anyway, I'm going to advance on our scratch tape to the second clip that I copied over there. We're going to mark in there, and then once again, we're just going to pick like 5 seconds of footage from the source tape here. That looks good. And now I'm just going to dub that over exactly like I did earlier, but this time it's in insert mode. Okay, we're rolling. There's the edit. And we're done. Now let's go back and take a look at what we got. Okay, here's the old footage. There's the new footage. We're about to cut back here. And there's the old footage again. And the edit is perfectly clean, since the control and TC tracks were untouched. So to this end, some editors actually recommend never using assemble at all. If you do your entire project in insert mode, then you can't ever cause damage like we saw earlier. The only catch, though, is that you can only use insert in spots where the TC and control tracks already exist. And that, in turn, is why editors recommend formatting the whole tape, no matter how little of it you intend to use. Not only does it allow you to use insert for an entire project, it also eliminates the possibility of performing an insert that accidentally runs off the end of the existing control and timecode tracks and writes signal into the void where it can't ever be retrieved. Formatting costs you between 5 to 90 minutes of downtime, so you do have to plan ahead to make time for it, but it saves you from a number of very unpleasant mistakes, making it well worth the inconvenience. But now that we understand all these morbid details, let's get back to the project. Let me put the Real Master back in. Now it's back to some real editing decisions. The first thing we have to do is find the first spot in the master video where I want to put a close-up. And I know that's going to be like a beauty shot that appears as I'm describing the materials. So let me figure out where that is. But first I need to move my headphones over here so I can hear the video I'm going through. These just based on the styling and materials. Okay, yeah, this is about where we want this to start. So now let's find the video that we want to put here. So I got to go back to the beginning where I did the first close-up. Okay, here we go. This looks about right. So we're going to start here. I'm going to mark in, but here's where things get interesting because I'm not going to mark out, at least not on the player side. You see, when I was assembling the rough cut, there was just one simple question. What clips will form the backbone of this video and in which order? Now, however, we have a more complicated problem. We want to replace the A shot in this video with a close-up. But how long should that close-up last? Well, I held the extension cord in front of the camera for like 2 minutes, so that's obviously overkill. We want more like 5 seconds, but we don't really know because the actual answer isn't one of time or what was in the source footage, it's one of performance. What I really want is for this close-up to dovetail with my speech. When I pick up the object, I want the punch-in to appear and then persist for a few words, whatever feels right. And that's something I can only judge based on the rough cut, not the source. So this is the spot in the finished video where I say the line. I've already marked my in point here, and now I'm going to select the out point on the recorder. You'll see why. It's definitely made out of Bakelite, which I don't think I've seen in an outlet splitter before, so that was a little novel, but that feels about right. So we're going to mark out there, and now if we preview this, look what happens. To be fair, I'm not sure exactly when it was made. I'd guess somewhere between the 20s and the 50s, just based on the styling and materials. There's the punch-in. It's definitely made out of Bakelite, which I don't think I've seen in an outlet splitter before, so that was a little novel, but it was also... And then we punch back out. And what you'll notice is that the audio stayed the same while just the picture changed, and that's because we were in insert mode, and I only had video enabled, so it left the audio tracks alone. The other thing, though, is we just copied this clip over without defining the in and out points on the player side. You can see the out light isn't even lit up, and yet if we press that, there is an out point. This is basically an algebra equation where you fill in any 3 figures and then the last variable is calculated from the other ones. So if we define in and out here and then define an in, it calculates the out for this side. But up until this point, we were defining the in and out here and then only defining the in on the recorder side, so it calculated the out automatically. But the editor always fills in whatever variable you didn't populate. So we always need to have 3 lights lit up here. Well, actually, I don't think that's true. I think if we just set in points and then hit go, it'll just roll to the end of the tape. But generally speaking, you want to have 3 lights lit up here in some combination, but you do need that many. I should point out, by the way, that I don't have a manual for this thing, and I had no idea that it could do this. It's just that partway through editing, it became obvious to me that it needed to work that way, so I tried it, and it did. This is why I love Pro Gear. It so often works the way that makes sense. Now, at this point, you can probably tell that that preview button is going to become a lot more valuable to us. Essential, actually, because, well, before it just showed us the basic cuts. Now it's going to help us see how these inserts will fit with the rest of the video. When we ran that preview, it showed us exactly what the finished product would look like, so I could see which parts of the original footage it was going to cover up, and I could hear how it interacted with my delivery. I felt that was pretty good, but if I thought that the close-up ran too long or came in too early or too late or whatever, I could now just hold down the appropriate buttons and trim them forward and back and preview it repeatedly until I was happy with it before I actually dubbed it over. Just like when we were doing the assembly, except now I have a second piece of data that I'm comparing to. So the preview really becomes essential. And it's probably obvious at this point that you're going to spend a lot of time in this phase of the edit. When I was doing the initial edit for the video that you watched earlier, I found myself previewing sometimes a dozen times in a row, carefully nudging the edit points back and forth so I had what I wanted. Since this one looks pretty good though, let's move on to a much tougher shot. The next edit here is going to be the unplug sequence, so let's go find that in the A shot. Oh, there it goes. Let's back up a little bit. Okay. Now this is a great place to make a point about another editing technique. When I showed you the rough cut earlier, you may have noticed that it's full of jump cuts, moments where the video leaps ahead, causing a jarring effect as I suddenly snap into a different position while the rest of the shot stays still. Now, in some cases, those happened because I made a mistake and had to redo a segment. In this case, it's because I just wasn't happy with that long period of downtime. But either way, this is just fundamental to the process of editing video. You're always going to have moments where there's discontinuities. Now, jump cuts where you actually see that discontinuity have been considered unacceptable in most TV production since its inception. They are a lot more permissible on YouTube, but I admit I don't love them either. My videos used to be full of jump cuts, but now you don't see very many of them because I cover them up cleverly. Every time the picture zooms in and out, that's usually me cheating. Don't get me wrong, I like the zooms as a narrative technique. I use them expressively, but I started using them originally to cover up jump cuts. And I assure you, you cannot tell where I'm doing one and where I'm doing the other because I'm really consistent between retakes. Really consistent between retakes. Really consistent between retakes. Really consistent between retakes. It's just a little movie magic for you. Anyway, I'd love to use that zoom in technique here to cover up this jump cut, but, well, you can't zoom standard def video, at least not without an effects processor, and even then it's going to look like crap. In conventional TV, you'd fix this by using two different cameras rolling at once at slightly different angles, so you can switch back and forth between them to cover up the mistakes, but I wasn't able to do that. So for most of the cuts in this video, I just put up with the jump cut, but here we have an opportunity to use B-roll for what it was invented for. To cover up jump cuts. We're going to do that, though, in a very stylish way. I'm going to start by dialing the recorder right up to that jump. There it is. And we're just going to back up a frame or two before I mark my endpoint. Once again, we're going to hit play to find a nice out point to reveal an outlet underneath. Okay, I think that's pretty good. And now I'll just find the moment where I pull this apart in the B-roll. Okay, here we go. This is it. Let's find the exact moment where it pops apart. Oh, there it is. And we're just going to walk back a few frames before this. We'll stop it there, mark our endpoint, and now we're going to preview this. Well, it was the modular design. Okay, here we go. Grab the top here and just pull. It pops apart. Oh, look at that. Got it on the first try. Wow. I'm kind of getting good at this. The goal was to get the action in the B-roll to match up with the sound in the A-roll so it would look like it was the same thing, as if I did have a second camera angle. I was all prepared to have to edit that 2 or 3 times to make it look better, but instead I just got it in one. All the same, though, I do feel like maybe the endpoint could have started a little bit sooner. Let's go to that. Grab the top here and just pull. Yeah, see, I think that could start a little bit sooner. So on the recorder side, we're going to take the endpoint, and I feel like, let's just back that off by like 20 frames. Then let's preview that one more time. If we grab the top here and just pull, that could honestly start even sooner. Let's back this off another like a little over half a second. If we grab the top here and just pull. Okay, so I like where that starts now. The trouble is that we drug the endpoint on the player side back with it. So now we have to back this off about the same distance. I had it perfect the first time, so obviously I had to then screw it up. If we grab the top here and just pull, it pops apart. No, not quite. The pop comes late. So what do we have to do here? If the pop comes late, then I think we have to walk this back a little bit further. If we grab the top here and just pull, it pops apart to reveal excellent, an outlet fantastic underneath. First try. And then second try also. Now, this is something that I'm very used to doing, but only in a nonlinear editor. So in like DaVinci Resolve, I would play back each clip independently, and I'd put a mark on the timeline at the exact moment where the event happened, and then I just slide them until they match up. Here, that's just impossible. It's just trial, error, and chops. You just gotta get good at it. I guess I'm getting pretty good at it. So at this point, you're probably getting the basic idea. Just like the assemble edit, we would go through the rest of our B-roll. We'd find shots that we want, and we'd go find places we want to put them. We'd mark the ins and outs, etc. And when we're all done, we'd hit the big red edit button, and it would copy each one over sequentially. The only difference in this case is that we're in insert mode instead of assemble, so it's only going to overwrite the video. So that's pretty much it, honestly. I could spend another half hour sitting here dialing in edits and then dubbing them all over, but in the end, we just end up with the same finished video that I showed you earlier. I don't think we need to spend the time on that. So let's just get to the wrap up. There is a little bit more to say about all of this technically, but what I'd like to talk about is the experience of working this way. Because as someone who started out in nonlinear editing, this gave me some pretty unusual feelings. Like, don't get me wrong, do I want to work this way? Hell no, not for love or money. But I have to admit it was invigorating. And I hate to be the millennial making this sort of deeply cringy statement on YouTube, oh my God, the way they used to do things is so quaint. The tone is warmer and more organic. So instead, I'd like to relate to experiences that I had around the time this was still in vogue. The result will still be just as cringy, but at least I can defend it as legitimate. You see, I used to be a hobby still photographer. I was for quite a while, actually. I think I could have been a pretty good artist if I'd stuck with it, but that's another story. While I would eventually get most of my experience on a digital SLR, I spent my first couple years shooting film on a mechanical Minolta from the mid-70s. And I did this not because it was hip, but because it was the done thing. There were no EOS digital rebels. Compact digital cameras were a joke, and the contemporary plastic fantastic film SLRs were also considered a joke by most hobbyists. So I used the Minolta because I had access to it. I found it in my parents' closet, and there was a wealth of information online on how to operate it correctly. And it was also just generally regarded as the correct kind of camera to start on. In 2000, new photographers shot on old manual cameras. This is just how it was. The only person who realized how hip it was John Waters, who was well ahead of the cultural curve.
Thank you, ma'am. Asshole.
So having established my credentials, I can tell you that this is very much a film-like experience. Despite the whole process being electronic, it is still very physical. The VTRs may be doing the work for me, but they're doing it on behalf of my hands. The act of wrenching the shuttles back and forth and hearing the tape move in response, seeing the video distort on the screen instantly in reaction to my motions, is like working the wind lever on a 35mm, or focusing with helicoids, or feeling an SLR mirror flap up and down. It feels grittier. But also, like pretty much any non-computerized process, your actions also feel weightier because they are. As I said earlier, dubbing represented the beginning of non-destructive editing, but only the beginning. There is still an element of the irreversible in every act you take. Yes, I did do the rough cut entirely in memory on the editor. I didn't commit anything until I was sure I liked it. But once it was laid down on the master tape, that became a new kind of original. So when it came time to do the inserts, there was a real sense of tension as I overwrote bits and pieces of something that I had already accomplished. With each insert that I added, I had to ask if I was really sure about it. I found myself genuinely nervous running the previews over and over, sometimes without even making any changes, just to be certain that I liked the audio and video and how they synced, where they fit into the mix. Because if I inserted something in the wrong place, that's it. All my work had to start over from scratch. I mean, sure, I could regenerate the rough cut from the true originals if need be, but since I'd already done the work and spent the time, it still represented lost progress. And I mean, my editor isn't sophisticated enough to store two separate timelines, so I had to wipe all the original events to make room for the inserts. Even if I noted all the time codes down on paper, which is what you were supposed to do back in the day, I still would have had to program them all back in, and avoiding all of that rework gave gravitas to my task. There were consequences for messing up. Now, I could, of course, have mitigated this by dubbing my master tape onto a copy, but since this is all analog, that would have imposed generation loss. Plus, it would have cost me another 3.5 minutes, and even longer if this was a bigger project. So when it comes down to it, I just had to do the work right. That's the trick, I think. Just don't screw up. If you screw up, you did a bad job, so don't. And this was true for every other form of creativity before the digital age. It is a truism that computers take all the risk out of things, from writing to sculpture to audio mixing. Everything can be undone with Control-Z. Layers can be toggled off, clips can be slid back and forth or removed entirely. It's all fungible, impermanent, inconsequential. Some say the ability of digital cameras to take 100 pictures in a row, then to simply erase them as if they never existed, devalues the art of photography. And having worked both ways, I have to say, yes, there's really something to that. But as with most philosophical questions about the tools of art, the counterpoints are always the same: time, accessibility, opportunity. Yeah, shooting on film makes you value every single shot, and it also makes you miss them. The best photo I ever took was shot out a bus window on a whim without looking or thinking. It was 7 a.m., I was dead tired, hungover, and barely conscious, but somehow I felt that there was something beautiful going on outside. So almost without looking, I turned on my Nikon DSLR, pressed it against the glass, and hit the shutter button. The result was the most atmospheric image I'd ever seen, let alone created. I've been thinking about it now for over a decade. It captivates me. I shot it. It's just that I never expected this outcome. So if the camera in my bag had film in it, I never would have wasted a frame of it on this wild hunch, and I would never know what I'd missed. Likewise, all the time you spend in a darkroom intimately involving yourself with the process of creating is time you could spend creating even more if you didn't have to do all this extra work just to make a picture appear. And when you're rewinding or swapping rolls of film, events and your imagination are passing you by. So yeah, when I shoot stills, I do it on digital. And even if I thought editing on tape was somehow putting more of me into the end product, which, I don't, I definitely wouldn't give up DaVinci Resolve for this. And that's saying something, because I really, really hate DaVinci.
DaVinci?
My opinion, in the end, is that linear editing is a fascinating way to work, but I strongly suspect that I speak for virtually all video editors when I say, thank God we brought an end to this. Nonlinear editing is just better, objectively, in every possible way, and I don't think anyone has ever wanted to go back, but I can't deny that it worked a lot better than I expected. It took me maybe 30 minutes to produce a 3.5-minute video, which is a 10-to-1 ratio at worst. It's actually really good, but it does beg the question, how did things improve from here? NLEs have completely replaced linear editing at this point, but it's not like they got invented and then just displaced everything all at once. In fact, they're a very old idea that took a very long time to catch on. The earliest example I can find was a paper from 1965 describing the idea as hyperfilm. It was actually very prescient, basically inventing not only the NLE as we now know it, but also the stopgap options that came first. See, while the earliest experiments with NLE were in the 80s or possibly the late 70s, it was cost prohibitive, among other things, to do it the way we do it now until the 2000s. So in between, there were solutions called hybrid NLEs, which still involved tape, but you did all of your editing decisions on the computer. There were also early hard drive-based solutions that still required a ton of add-on hardware to work. There were also dedicated accelerators sold to prosumers in the 90s. And finally, there were early glimmerings of the modern all-software approach that were implemented way before they should have been practical. For instance, I'd like to talk about what it was like to edit a video on iMovie on an iMac DV in 1999 compared to a contemporary professional package like Final Cut Pro on a much faster machine, because the results will probably surprise you. But I'd also like to explore how linear editing worked for consumers and low-end pros because, as I've implied several times with this thing, these Baroque editing controllers eventually got cut down into much smaller and cheaper offerings for dads and wedding videographers. And this one is my favorite example because it does almost everything we just saw, except it uses a pair of consumer camcorders as VTRs. Absolutely fascinating. I also have some devices that can do some of this work over FireWire with no editing controller at all, so there's a lot of ground to cover. I'm excited about these future videos, obviously. I'd wanted to make them all a long time ago, but before I could do it, I needed to show you the foundations of video editing as it was for 30 to 40 years, and to the best of my knowledge, that's what you just saw. So I hope it was as entertaining as it was informative, or that it was at least informative. If you enjoyed this or found it useful, consider subscribing to my channel. I try to make stuff more interesting than this as often as possible. We just got to get through the work sometimes before we can do the fun stuff. Remember to turn on notifications if you want to find out when I upload new stuff. But if you really liked this, consider supporting me on Patreon like these folks are. This is my full-time job, and my patrons are the only reason I'm able to afford rent, food, gas in my car, and the things I use to demonstrate stuff in my videos, at least when I can find them and when they work. Without the studio, though, which my patrons pay for, I wouldn't even have space to set up and demo these things. There's no way I could do this at home, let me tell you. So I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who's supporting me. Thank you all so much. I couldn't do it without you. And to everyone else, thanks for watching.